In the early spring of 2001, the quiet, rural roads of Arkansas held a secret that would remain buried for nearly 2 decades. Jennifer Moore, a 34-year-old mother, was driving her 6-year-old son, Noah, through a narrow, winding back road. The family they were visiting lived miles away from the nearest town, and the route Jennifer chose was supposed to be a shortcut, a familiar path she had taken many times before. But that day, something went wrong. Jennifer never arrived at her destination. Noah's bright laughter, usually filling the car, was silenced. The small SUV vanished without a trace. The only sign of their journey was a single phone call, Jennifer's voice, calm but distracted, saying she was almost there. After that, nothing. Local authorities launched a search. Roads were combed, nearby woods scoured, and the riverbanks checked for signs of the missing mother and son. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The community held its breath, clinging to hope. But no car was found, no clues. It was as if Jennifer and Noah had simply vanished into thin air. The case grew cold. 18 years passed. Then, unexpectedly, a discovery deep in the woods stirred the past. A man clearing an old tool shed on his newly inherited land uncovered something strange. A burnt license plate, barely recognizable, buried beneath blackened debris, and a fragment of a plastic child's toy, scorched but intact. The license plate matched Jennifer's missing vehicle, but there had never been any report of fire in the area. No records, no witnesses. And the shed? No one knew who had built it, or how it came to be there. The past was reaching out, demanding to be remembered. The tool shed stood hidden in the thick woods, surrounded by towering pines and tangled underbrush. To the new landowner, Mark Turner, it was just an old relic, forgotten, weathered by years of neglect. When he inherited the property from a distant relative he barely knew, the shed was a curiosity at best, a minor nuisance at worst. Mark had decided to clear the area to make space for a small cabin. As he pushed aside rotting wood and piles of debris, he noticed something unusual beneath the ashes, a twisted piece of metal. Kneeling down, he wiped away soot and dirt, revealing the charred remains of a license plate. The faded letters were just legible enough. The sequence matched a missing vehicle reported years ago. A chill ran down his spine. Why would such an item be here, hidden behind this shed in the middle of nowhere? Then, among the ashes, Mark found another fragment, a broken plastic piece, part of a toy. It was unmistakably from a child's plaything, a small, colorful piece, blackened but still visible. Questions flooded his mind. How long had these items been here? Was the shed itself the scene of a fire? And if so, why had no one noticed? Mark's curiosity grew into obsession. He began researching local archives and police reports, uncovering the haunting story of Jennifer Moore and her son Noah, two souls who vanished without a trace one spring day in 2001. The discovery of the burnt license plate reopened old wounds for the community and reignited a mystery no one had been able to solve. Who had left these remnants behind, and what truth lay buried beneath the ashes? News of Mark's discovery spread quickly through the small town. Reporters arrived, cameras flashing, turning the forgotten case into a sudden headline after nearly 2 decades of silence. For many, the memory of Jennifer Moore and little Noah was a shadowy presence, an unanswered question hanging over their lives. Detective Sarah Collins, now retired, had originally worked the case. She had never stopped thinking about it. When she heard about the burnt license plate, something stirred deep inside her. An old ache, a promise she had made to herself long ago. She would find the truth. Sarah contacted Mark and arranged to visit the property. Standing beside the crumbling shed, she examined the charred remains with a seasoned eye. The fire damage was extensive, but strangely localized. There were no signs of a widespread blaze in the surrounding forest, no reports from neighbors, no emergency calls. It was as if the fire had been carefully concealed. The broken toy fragment disturbed Sarah the most. It was the kind of simple plastic piece a 6-year-old would cherish, a relic of innocence destroyed by violence or accident. Its presence here suggested a story no one had yet told. She pulled out her phone and began making calls, reopening old files and re-interviewing witnesses who had long since moved on with their lives. But as Sarah dug deeper, new questions surfaced. Who had built this shed? Why had it been abandoned? And how had the license plate ended up beneath the ashes? A few locals remembered rumors, whispers of strange figures seen late at night, strange lights flickering through the trees, but no one wanted to talk. The past was not only buried, it was guarded. Sarah knew this case was far from over. Something dark and hidden lay beneath the surface of this quiet town, and she was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The discovery of the burnt license plate sent ripples through the town, but for Jennifer Moore's family, the years of silence had already taken a toll. Her mother, Mary, still lived in the same house she had when Jennifer went missing. The walls were filled with old photographs, faded and cracked, but still vivid with memories. On the mantel above the fireplace was a single frame, one of Jennifer's last family photos with Noah, smiling in the warm glow of a summer evening. Mary had never given up hope that Jennifer and her son were still out there, somewhere. Though the years had passed, the grief never dulled, and neither did the unshakable feeling that something wasn't right about the case. Sarah Collins visited Mary, hoping to gather more context about Jennifer's life, to understand who she had been before her disappearance. Sitting in the dimly lit living room, Sarah felt the weight of the years pressing down on the conversation. "I've always believed my daughter is out there, Detective. Somewhere. But I don't know where," Mary said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "She wouldn't just leave Noah. She loved him too much, and she wouldn't have gone down that back road if she wasn't planning to come back." Jennifer's choice to take the back road had always seemed odd to authorities. Why would she choose such a secluded, narrow path when the main highway was just a few miles away? Some speculated that it was an accident, others thought it might have been foul play, but no one had ever been able to confirm either. Mary shifted in her chair, a deep sadness creeping into her eyes. "Jennifer was different before Noah. I don't know if anyone ever told you this, but she wasn't always happy. There were a lot of things she kept hidden from everyone, things she didn't talk about. I think maybe she was running from something, or someone." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had never heard this before. Mary hesitated, her fingers trembling around the edge of her teacup. "When Jennifer was younger, she was always the brave one. But she had her secrets. I knew she was scared of something. She never told me what it was. And after Noah was born, she started keeping to herself more. She didn't talk about her past, not even to me." It was the first real lead Sarah had gotten since reopening the case. The flashbacks started to piece together a different story, one of a woman whose life had been tangled with shadows. Jennifer's relationship with her own mother had been strained, but it seemed like there was more beneath the surface. Sarah dug into Jennifer's background, checking for old relationships, any hint of danger or anyone who might have had a motive to harm her. But the deeper Sarah went, the more questions there were. Who was Jennifer running from? What had she left behind? And most chilling of all, how was the past still reaching into the present? As the sun set over the town, Sarah stood by the window in Mary's living room, her mind racing with possibilities. There was something dark that had happened years ago, something connected to the back road, to that shed, and to the fire that had consumed the truth. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place, but with every answer came a deeper, more unsettling question. Sarah's mind was a web of unanswered questions. The discovery of the burnt license plate had unearthed more than just a long-forgotten relic. It had opened a door to a past Jennifer Moore had buried. The more Sarah investigated, the clearer it became. The disappearance wasn't just a simple case of a mother and child lost in the woods. There was something deeper, something far more sinister at play. Sarah dug further into Jennifer's history. The more she uncovered, the more she felt like she was walking through a fog, never quite able to make out the full picture. Jennifer had kept her life private, but there were still a few people who remembered her from before she became a mother, before she moved to Arkansas and started a new life. One of them was Gary Holt, a man who had once worked with Jennifer at a small diner in a neighboring town. When Sarah tracked him down, he seemed hesitant at first, unsure of why someone would still be asking about Jennifer after so many years. "I didn't know her all that well," Gary said, eyes darting nervously as he sipped his coffee in the quiet diner. "But she wasn't happy, Not like she was pretending to be. She was always looking over her shoulder, like she was waiting for something bad to happen. We all thought maybe she was running from something, but no one ever asked." Gary's voice dropped to a whisper, as if saying it aloud might make it real. "There were rumors about her before she moved. Some people thought she was hiding from an abusive relationship. Others thought it was something worse. There were talks of debts, of people coming to her house looking for money, but she'd never talk about it. She shut everyone out." Sarah leaned in, absorbing every word. Abusive relationships were a common thread in missing person cases, but something about Gary's words felt off, like a piece of the puzzle Sarah couldn't quite place. "Did she ever say anything specific?" Sarah pressed. Gary shook his head. "She was tight-lipped, but there were times when she'd act scared, like she was afraid of being found. One night she just up and left, said she was going to visit family, but we all knew she didn't have any family around here." A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. Jennifer's life before Noah was starting to sound less like a new beginning and more like an escape, a flight from something that had followed her across state lines, something that might have caught up with her on that rural back road. The deeper Sarah dug, the more the past seemed to bleed into the present, like an old wound reopening. The shed behind Mark Turner's property was still central to the mystery. Sarah returned to the site, combing the area for any more evidence. She had an unsettling feeling that the shed wasn't just a place to hide objects. It was a place to hide people. Mark had mentioned a few oddities about the shed's construction. No one seemed to know who built it, or when. The fire damage to the license plate and toy fragment suggested someone had tried to destroy evidence, but why? And why in that particular location? It was when Sarah examined the edges of the debris more closely that she found something else, something she wasn't expecting. A small, scorched piece of fabric, barely visible beneath the blackened ruins. She pulled it out carefully. It was a fragment of children's clothing, no doubt about it. The fabric was worn, but the stitching was still intact enough to make out part of the design, a cartoon character, faded from years of exposure to the elements. Noah. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The presence of a piece of Noah's clothing could only mean one thing. The shed hadn't been a random place to dump evidence. It had been a place where Noah had been kept. It was as if he had been there, trapped at some point before being moved, or worse. A sick feeling twisted in Sarah's stomach as she realized the implications. Whoever had been involved in this knew Jennifer and Noah. This wasn't just a chance discovery. This was someone's careful attempt to bury the truth, and Sarah was getting closer to unearthing it all. The fabric fragment had rattled Sarah more than she cared to admit. It was a piece of the puzzle she hadn't expected, and it added a layer of urgency to her investigation. Noah's clothes. Was it possible that the boy had been held in that shed? Was there a connection between the shed and Jennifer's disappearance? The more she thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit together, and the more unsettling it became. The discovery also raised new questions. If Noah had been there, then where was he now? And if someone had kept him in that shed, had they done the same to Jennifer? The burning of the evidence, clothes, toys, a license plate, was not random. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase any trace of what happened to them. It was late when Sarah returned to the station, her mind still racing. She sat in front of her computer, scanning through the case files again, hoping for something she'd missed. Her eyes lingered on the list of potential witnesses, most of whom had already been questioned years ago. But there was one name that stood out, one that had never been properly followed up on. It was a name from the town's old records, Luke Harris, a man with a criminal background who had lived near the back road where Jennifer and Noah vanished. According to the files, he had a history of domestic violence and had been seen in the area around the time of their disappearance. But there had been no solid evidence connecting him to the case, and the investigation had quickly moved on without further inquiry. Luke had been in and out of prison for most of his life, and his last known address was a farmhouse, not far from where the shed had been found. No one had bothered to investigate further, but Sarah's gut told her there was more to the story. She tracked Luke down through a local informant, a man who had known him during his time in prison. The informant told Sarah that Luke had been living in the area at the time of Jennifer's disappearance, but there was something more troubling: rumors of his connection to a shadowy group involved in illegal activities, a group that had a history of abducting people and using them for purposes no one in the town dared to discuss. The informant had warned Sarah to be careful. Luke was dangerous. If he had been involved in Jennifer's disappearance, it was likely that he had been part of something far larger than anyone could have imagined. With the informant's information, Sarah paid a visit to the old farmhouse. The place was run down, its windows boarded up, and the door hanging off its hinges. It felt like a place forgotten by time, a place where secrets had been buried and left to rot. Inside, the house was eerily silent. Dust covered everything, and the air smelled of stale earth. Sarah's flashlight cut through the darkness as she moved cautiously through the house. The floor creaked under her feet, and the walls seemed to close in on her with each step. In the back room she found something that made her blood run cold. Hidden behind a pile of old furniture was a metal trunk, its edges rusted and worn. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Her hand trembled as she pried the lid open, her heart racing in anticipation of what she might find inside. The trunk was empty, save for a few scraps of old fabric. But it was the smell that hit her next, the unmistakable scent of gasoline. Someone had tried to burn something here, something they didn't want anyone to find. Sarah's mind raced. The connection between Luke and the shed was becoming clearer by the second. If Luke had been involved, he had likely used that farmhouse as a hideout, a place to stash evidence and maybe even hold Jennifer and Noah for a while. But where were they now, and why hadn't anyone connected him to the case before? As Sarah stood in the dark, empty room, she realized just how deep this investigation went. Luke wasn't just a witness. He was a player in a much larger story, one that was about to unfold in ways she hadn't yet imagined. The past was coming back with a vengeance. The discovery of the gasoline-scented trunk sent Sarah's mind into overdrive. What had Luke been hiding? Why the attempt to burn evidence? And what role did he play in Jennifer and Noah's disappearance? The more she thought about it, the more the pieces started to form a dark, twisted picture. Luke Harris had always been a figure of suspicion, but now it was becoming clear that he was more than just a local criminal. Sarah had uncovered whispers of a network, a group operating on the fringes of society, involved in the trafficking of people, women and children, whom they sought to exploit. These were the shadows lurking in the town's history, and Jennifer and Noah's case had likely been tangled up in it all along. But it was not just the town's secrets that concerned Sarah. It was the feeling, one she could never shake, that someone was watching her. Every step she took seemed to be met with a pair of eyes lurking just beyond the corner of her vision. And the deeper she dug, the more she felt the walls closing in. That night, after her visit to Luke's farmhouse, Sarah was unnerved. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. The town felt different, as if the people who once walked its streets in broad daylight now moved in the shadows. She decided to return to the shed behind Mark Turner's property. Something about that place unsettled her. It had all the hallmarks of a carefully constructed trap. When she arrived, the area was quiet, bathed in the eerie silence of the woods. The shed stood there like a dark sentinel, untouched by time, but somehow exuding a malignant presence. As she walked around it, her flashlight flicked across something she hadn't noticed before, something buried under a pile of rocks near the rear of the shed. She knelt down, brushing aside the stones, revealing an old, rusted lockbox. Its metal surface was tarnished, but the lock was still intact. Sarah's pulse quickened. This was new. Something had been deliberately hidden here. With trembling hands, she pried open the lock and lifted the lid. Inside, there were documents, old and modded, but legible enough to make out the contents. Photographs, names, and dates, all connected to a network that had been operating for years, perhaps even decades. The documents were detailed, listing names of people who had gone missing, some whose disappearances had never been solved, and there, at the bottom of the pile, was a familiar face. Jennifer Moore. Her photograph was clipped to a document, along with a list of instructions that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Keep her under surveillance. Ensure her compliance. Noah is the leverage. The words were chilling. Jennifer and Noah hadn't just been taken. They had been part of something much darker, something organized and calculated. This wasn't just about a random kidnapping. This was about control. Suddenly, Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She wasn't alone. The rustling of leaves broke the stillness, and she spun around, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. In the distance, a figure stood motionless, watching her. The beam of light caught only the outline of a man, but it was enough to make her heart race. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steady despite the surge of panic rising in her chest. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it turned and disappeared into the woods, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Sarah's breath hitched. Whoever it was, they had been watching her, and they had been expecting her to find the lockbox. Her instincts screamed that she had just uncovered the heart of something far bigger than she had anticipated. She quickly snapped pictures of the documents, then secured them in her bag. But as she turned to leave, she hesitated. The woods were no longer the quiet sanctuary they had been before. They were alive with danger, and the man, whoever he was still out there. As Sarah made her way back to her car, her mind raced. The connection between the shed, Luke Harris, and the trafficking ring was becoming clearer. But the puzzle was far from complete. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that Jennifer and Noah's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger web, a web that had ensnared more victims than anyone had ever imagined. But who had been pulling the strings all this time? And how far would they go to protect their secrets? Sarah was closing in on the truth, but she was no longer sure if she would survive long enough to expose it. The documents in Sarah's bag were more than just pieces of paper. They were the key to unraveling the terrifying network that had been operating beneath the surface of this quiet town. Every name listed, every photograph, seemed to paint a picture of a dark, underground operation, one that had been manipulating lives for years, hiding in plain sight. As she drove back to the station, the weight of the investigation pressed down on her chest. The closer she got to the truth, the more isolated she felt. The town that had once been a peaceful, picturesque place now felt suffocating, as if the air itself was thick with secrets. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She had barely made it to her office when her phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Stop digging, you're in over your head." Her pulse quickened. The message wasn't a threat. It was a warning. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to cover their tracks. They were actively tracking Sarah's every move. She deleted the message, trying to steady her breath, but the sense of dread only grew. She couldn't stop now, not when she was so close. Her first priority was to get the documents to someone she could trust, but as she scanned the room for her partner, Detective Mark Davies, she realized that she hadn't seen him all day. He wasn't answering his phone, and his desk was empty. That was strange. Mark was always here, especially when a case like this was in motion. A sudden thought struck her. Was Mark involved in this? It was the first time she'd considered it, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. He had been with the department for years, had access to every file, and had been a close ally through the investigation into Jennifer and Noah's disappearance. She shook the thought away. No, Mark couldn't be part of this. He had to be one of the good guys. But the feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. She had to be sure. Sarah left her office, her eyes scanning the station as she moved toward the locker room. The The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows along the narrow hallways. It was then that she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The door to the evidence room was slightly ajar. It wasn't supposed to be open. Only authorized personnel had access to the room, and Sarah had made sure all evidence was locked away after she retrieved the documents from the shed. Her heart raced as she moved closer to the door. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open, the creak of the hinges breaking the silence. The room was empty. No sign of Mark, no sign of anyone. But as her eyes scanned the shelves filled with case files and boxes, she spotted something that made her stomach churn. The documents she had taken from the shed, the ones she had planned to keep safe, were missing. Her mind whirled. Someone had been in here, and they had taken the most important piece of evidence. But who? Suddenly, her phone buzzed again. It was another text message from the same unknown number. "We know what you're doing. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." This time, there was no hesitation in Sarah's movements. She knew what she had to do. She had to find Mark, and she had to find him fast. He was the only one who might know where the documents had gone, and who was behind the threatening messages. Her search for Mark led her through the winding streets of the town. It was late, and most of the town had settled into quiet slumber, but the shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. Her steps quickened as she approached his apartment building, her mind racing. She couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong. When she reached his apartment, the door was cracked open, as though it had been left hastily ajar. She pushed it open, her hand instinctively reaching for her weapon, though she knew it wouldn't help her against the kind of people she was dealing with now. Inside, Mark was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. His face was pale, his eyes wide with an unfocused, glassy stare. "Mark?" Sarah called softly, her voice trembling with concern. "Mark, what's going on?" He didn't respond. Her hand shook as she approached him. There was something off about the whole scene. She noticed a faint smell in the air, something bitter, almost chemical. "Mark," she whispered again, kneeling in front of him. It was then that she saw the syringe on the table next to him, the needle still glinting in the low light. Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach. She had seen this before: drug overdoses, people who were coerced into doing things they didn't understand, their minds clouded by substances. But why was Mark in this state? Who had done this to him? And more importantly, what did it mean for her? Suddenly, Mark's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto hers. His voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper. "Get out of here. They know. They're coming for you." The words hit Sarah like a freight train. She wasn't just chasing a cold case. She had become the target. The words Mark had whispered to her echoed in Sarah's mind, rattling her nerves. "They know. They're coming for you." The air was thick with danger now, every corner of the town feeling like it was closing in on her. She had uncovered too much, and someone, or something, was hell-bent on stopping her. She left Mark's apartment quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. His words rang in her ears, but she couldn't afford to linger. She had to act, and fast. The deeper she got into this investigation, the more perilous it became. She had learned that Jennifer Moore and her son Noah had been part of something far more sinister than she could have ever imagined. A trafficking ring that had operated for years, preying on the vulnerable. But what was the connection between the traffickers and the local authorities? And why had Mark been targeted? There were too many unanswered questions, and the clock was ticking. Her only option was to confront the people at the center of it all, the ones who had been hiding in plain sight, manipulating everything from the shadows. The network wasn't just confined to a group of criminals. It had deep roots in the very heart of the town. People who she had trusted, people she had worked alongside, had been involved from the start. As Sarah drove, the weight of it all crushed her. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following her, lurking in the darkness, just out of sight. The streets were empty, but every shadow felt alive. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, the hum of the tires on the asphalt the only sound in the car. Then she saw them. Two black SUVs appeared behind her in the rearview mirror. their headlights cutting through the night like predatory eyes. Sarah's blood ran cold. She wasn't just being followed anymore. She was being hunted. She slammed her foot on the gas pedal, her car accelerating down the winding roads. The pursuit was relentless. Every turn she took, they took it too. The world outside the car became a blur, the headlights of the SUVs growing larger with every passing second. The chase took them to the outskirts of town, where the road curved into the dark woods. Sarah knew the area well. This was where she had found the shed, where the secrets had been buried. She could feel the presence of danger closing in on her. Every breath a battle to stay calm. Then, just as she reached a sharp bend in the road, Sarah made a split-second decision. She swerved hard, taking the car off the road and into the dense trees. Her tires screeched as she lost control, the vehicle tumbling over rough terrain. But she didn't stop. She gritted her teeth, pushing forward through the trees, the SUV's headlights fading into the distance. For a moment, it was silent. The pursuit had stopped, but Sarah knew better than to think she had lost them. She had just bought herself a few minutes, nothing more. She took the wheel once more, driving deeper into the woods, hoping to lose her pursuers. The car bounced along the uneven ground, but she kept her focus. She was almost there, the place where everything had begun, where the final answers waited. Sarah reached the shed once more, her breath ragged, her heart still pounding. She parked the car and climbed out, the cold night air hitting her like a wall. There was no turning back now. The final confrontation was at hand. As she approached the shed, she heard movement in the distance, footsteps low and steady. The men who had been chasing her were closing in. But Sarah wasn't afraid anymore. She had the documents. She had the truth. And it was time to end this. She moved swiftly, positioning herself at the rear of the shed, where she had uncovered the lockbox earlier. Her hand tightened around the handle of her weapon, though she knew she wouldn't need it. She wasn't just going to fight them off. She was going to expose everything they had done. And then they came. Luke Harris was the first to appear from the shadows, flanked by two other men. His face twisted into a smirk, but there was a coldness in his eyes, a knowledge that his time was up. "You think you've won?" Luke said, his voice low and taunting. "This has been going on for years. You think you can stop it? You have no idea what you're up against." Sarah stood her ground, her eyes hardening. "I know exactly what I'm up against, and I'm done running." Before Luke could react, the sound of sirens cut through the silence. Mark Davies, though clearly weakened, had made one last phone call. The local law enforcement had arrived, and they weren't alone. They had backup from the state police, as well as federal agents, who had been monitoring the trafficking network Sarah had uncovered. The men around Luke hesitated, their eyes flickering to the flashing lights in the distance. They knew it was over. Luke's smirk faltered. "You're too late," he spat, but the words lacked the same confidence they had before. "They'll come for you, all of you." But Sarah didn't hesitate. She moved forward, pulling the documents from her bag. "The truth's already out," she said firmly. "You're done." The authorities swarmed in, arresting the men and securing the evidence. The trafficking ring that had operated in the shadows for so long was finally exposed, and those responsible would face justice. But for Sarah, it wasn't just about the criminals who were taken into custody. It was about giving Jennifer and Noah the closure they deserved. As she watched the agents take Luke away, Sarah's thoughts turned to the mother and son. She hadn't found them alive, but their story wasn't over. They would never be forgotten. The town was finally free from the dark web that had gripped it for so long, but for Sarah, the battle was just beginning. There were still other victims out there, other cases that needed her attention. She wasn't going to stop now. The truth had been uncovered, and Sarah wasn't done seeking justice.